So our purpose in speaking with you tonight is to share with you what the town is being required to do under the new Chapter 40A, Section 3A legislation. And this is a new law that requires cities and towns within the MBTA service area, including North Reading, which is adjacent to 3 towns that have commuter rail stations, to zone for multifamily housing. And we'd like to present the new requirements and discuss with you the CPC's proposed approach to complying. And compliance is going to require zoning changes to need to be made at town meetings. So we would like to make sure we speak with you about that before that meeting takes place to discuss any concerns that you may have about how this could potentially impact the schools. And just to be clear, the zoning changes that the CPC will be proposing are not the result of their own initiative or any other local planning effort. It's just a response to the new state mandate. And because the mandate requires a planning and a zoning response, the CPC is the board tasked with addressing the town's obligations under the new law. Our goal is to have the town's requirements met with the zoning change at June town meeting in 2024. And zoning changes that could introduce more multifamily housing, tend to raise questions about school impacts and enrollment, which is why we felt it was important to meet with you well in advance of that meeting. A new Section 3A of the Zoning Act was signed into law in January 2021, and in 2022, the state released guidelines for communities outlining those new requirements. The new part of the Zoning Act requires MBTA communities, including MBTA Adjacent Communities with no service within their borders, to have at least one zoning district that allows multifamily zoning by right. The state has released a compliance tool to assist communities with figuring out whether their proposed districts would fit. And the CPC and I have been working on a proposed district using those tools provided by the state. And we have what we think is a workable proposal, which I'll be discussing shortly. A major consequence of not complying with the new statute would be becoming ineligible for funding from 3 of the state's competitive grant programs, MassWorks, which the town has relied on in the past and expects to continue to rely on for a number of infrastructure projects, the Housing Choice Program, which can provide funds for capital and planning projects, and a local capital projects fund, which provides housing authorities with a portion of their funding. Compliance status may come into decisions about other grants too, and that's at the discretion of state staff. And additionally, the Attorney General's office recently released an advisory March of this year clarifying that 3A is in fact a mandate and communities don't have the choice to not comply and simply forego the funds. So this is just an excerpt from what we were all sent. Communities were sent back in the spring. So as you can see on this map, North Reading is categorized by the state as MBTA Adjacent Community. And there's a set of rules for communities in each of these categories, including where a suitable multifamily district has to be located and the number of multifamily units it has to allow in that zoning district by right. And because North Reading does not have any land area within half a mile of a train or a bus station, we are not required to have our district within a half a mile of transit, as many other communities are. However, we are still required to have a district. It just can be in a location of our choosing that is appropriately near other services or other reasons we believe it might be an appropriate area. We're required to have a zoning district of at least 50 acres, or we can have multiple districts of 5 acres each, adding up to 50 acres, but at least one of those has to be 25 acres. So these are large land areas. This district must allow multifamily housing by right. Multifamily is designed as 3 or more units per structure. The minimum gross density will need to be 15 units to the acre. The zoning needs to allow a capacity of at least 750 multifamily units by right. The focus of the statute is on what the zoning allows, not necessarily what will be built, and so there's no production requirement associated with this. Land needs to be developable to count, as in it can't be floodplain, water, wetlands, or public lands. The zoning can't restrict age or the number of bedrooms. And nowhere in North Reading currently has zoning that fully complies with this, though we do have a large area that comes very close. So the CPC, oh, of course.
I'm the kind of person that don't ask it, it leaves the head.
Yeah.
So the age requirement. So if there was, say, 55 plus multifamily housing, that would, by calling it like 55 plus, that wouldn't cover them. Right?
If it was in the zoning, it wouldn't count. But if it was not in the zoning and say, for example, like Martin's Landing is the perfect example, it's not in the zoning that it has to be age restricted, that particular project happens to be age restricted. So as long as the underlying zoning doesn't have a restriction on age, that's fine. It's up to the individual owner developer.
Does that count towards the eventual 750 units?
So we don't actually have to produce 750 units.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like as Lauren said, not yet, but obviously, like someday probably, so.
You know, because that hasn't been announced as a requirement, I haven't even spent a minute looking into it, so I just don't know.
I just wonder, because we obviously are really needing housing for older adults in the
Sure.
town, so it would be nice if you could kind of hit for it.
Sure. Because it's something that hasn't been proposed yet, it's just not really something I know. So what the state has been talking to us about, whatever area you're proposing, you have to imagine that it's completely raised and redeveloped from scratch. So whatever a person could do by right through the permitting process is what counts. Actual units being built just hasn't come into the conversation yet at all. So we really are picturing empty, barren land area. Everything gets knocked down and totally redeveloped is what we're picturing. So the CPC has been discussing these requirements, and they're recommending targeting 100 and 104 Lowell Road as the town's compliant district. These two properties already have a high concentration of multifamily housing, and they already have the benefit of by right zoning for that use. This area is a good candidate for our suitable zoning district, but it would need some changes in order to become fully compliant. This would include eliminating the special permit requirement that's always required for the site plan review process. Site plan review could still be done, but we would not be able to require a special permit in association with it as we do now for all site plan review developments. We have already run the state's compliance model on those two properties, and we do believe that they will comply with, as long as those zoning changes that I mentioned were made, we believe that the state would accept that as our district.
One of the issues that would come up would be Martin's Landing, where they might resist this. They might resist the zoning change because it would change what was available, what could be done with that particular location. So that's our only really concern right there. Is I think for that area over there, I don't think anybody's gonna have any complaint because it's mostly rental units. But that's the so we are including Martin's Landing in this, and it is. But that's really the only place where I would anticipate any pushback. On the zone, only on the zoning change. They have nothing to say about the mandate is the mandate. But we just have to make sure that we, at town meeting, and that's why one of the reasons we're presenting to you, because we need to all support this situation because we don't really have much of a choice. And if we support it, we get it through, then we'll have some level of control over it anyway. Sorry, guys, I'll point that out.
How are those zoned right now? I don't.
So right now, they are zoned for multifamily by right. The difference is that between what we have and what we need is that all site plan review properties or all site plan review projects require a special permit from the Planning Commission. So that would need to be eliminated. Otherwise, so we have to zone for a capacity that would allow up to 750 units. Those two properties together are already permitted for over 900 units. So we're definitely well within what the state wants us to do for the zoning district. We would just have to remove the special permit requirement. So that's the reasoning that the CPC has had for this approach, is that the properties are already zoned for multifamily housing, and just compliance really would just take adjusting that zoning for the requirement of the special permit. Future redevelopment is a possibility, but one or both properties would really need to be redeveloped and newly permitted and built in order to realize that new as of right permitting, which could happen down the road. So anytime we change zoning, we have to expect that what we're zoning for could be built. And this is a response to what the CPC has anticipated to be the town's greatest concerns about the legislation. This is a proposal that doesn't identify a new area of town in which to introduce new housing. It's a conservative approach. It anticipates the smallest possible impact. And in discussing this approach, the CPC has been hopeful that the proposal would be, acceptable to the school committee based on how it minimizes changes to the town and the expected corresponding impact to the schools. Our hope is our next steps anticipated would be public meetings this fall and winter, probably 2 of them. We are also going to be working with a housing consultant to support our analysis of this approach and to be sure we're not missing anything and we're doing it correctly. We'll be working on drafting the zoning bylaw amendment that would comply with the 3A regulations, do a final run of the compliance model and submit the results to the state to ensure those zoning changes would be accepted. And then we would hold the required public hearing for the proposed zoning changes in advance of June town meeting, and then hopefully have the vote at town meeting. So this is just kind of our explanation of what we're doing with this and why. Our goal is a zoning change at town meeting. We wanted to see if you had any initial feedback for us, things you would like us to look at or work on, questions we can answer for you.
I have
Mr. McGowan.
a clarifying question. So 100 and 104, is that Edgewood and Martin's Landing, or is it?
Yes.
It's just those 2 pieces of property?
Right, right.
So in order for the zoning, the new zoning to be used, it would be with basically a redevelopment of those properties.
It would be a redevelopment. There could be some possibility of adding to what's on there already, but there is another limitation on those properties, which is that they're in an aquifer protection district. And so in order to get more than 15% impervious area, they would need another special permit. Now, in order to completely, take advantage of the by right zoning and build by right completely without needing to get a special permit, they really would need to redevelop it.
Tear down the existing structure.
Yeah, because adding to it would require the putting in of more impervious area, which then would trigger the aquifer protection limitations.
Do you know how many units are currently between those 2?
Edgewood has 406 units, and Martin's Landing is permitted for 502, and about half of that is built.
So essentially, in order to be compliant, you just have to change the zoning laws. Nothing is going to change right now. And those, to me, those are relatively new structures, so it would be a pretty major change for those to be modified or raised or anything like that. So that's something that would be a huge undertaking and maybe not that likely right away.
That would be our expectation too.
So all of my questions may make you think I'm going one way, but I'll start with the opposite and just say I support the plan. Overall, I think it is the most minimal way to do it. And at this point in time, when all you have to do is comply with the zoning, I feel like that's probably all you need to do, and you probably do the easiest thing. I don't know that that's what you should do for planning purposes if you actually wanted to develop something. So my other questions would be, number one, the project that's being proposed, I don't know what they're calling it, the Nightmare on Elm Street or whatever they want to call it, like project that's being proposed over by Teresa's, would that area meet the requirements or not?
No, it's actually too small.
Okay.
Yeah, just a single lot, basically.
Okay, it's not a big enough zoning district over there.
So that in combination with other properties could add up to, it has to add up to 50, but by itself, that property is,
25.
I think it's is it less than 20? It's around 20 acres. It's not, it's small.
That wouldn't even be the biggest, because you have to have at least one 25-acre lot,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that wouldn't even be enough. Okay, and then in terms of like, was there any discussion about anywhere on Main Street or not? 28?
We didn't really discuss it, and I think that's because over the years, the CPC has talked about the possibility of changing the zoning on Main Street to allow for housing again. And it's swung back and forth in terms of the sentiment about that. What the CPC ended up doing a few years ago is choosing a few properties at the intersection of 62 and 28 to rezone with an overlay. And so there is a small collection of properties now that does allow multifamily housing by special permit. It's pretty small, though. The whole area is about 10 acres altogether with all of those properties together. And there really has not been much of a movement to expand that. It's possible that there could be in the future, and I think it really depends on what the CPC's vision for the town and what the perception is of what the town would like to see. It's been a tough one. I mean, some people we've spoken to are pretty supportive of introducing more housing to Main Street, and others are really not. And so I don't think there has been a strong enough swell of public support to do that they've really pursued that. And if I feel free to jump in, Dave or Warren, if you, think I've missed anything there in that answer.
No, I don't think so, and again, you'd have to have, if you were gonna try to move this situation from the Edgewood and the Martin's Landing location, you would still have to have at least one 25-acre anchor
Right.
plot piece. And then you could maybe add cereces on and others, and you can build and assemble it, but I don't think it's gonna happen. Everything's so new over there. Well, Edgewood is not so new, but but Martin's Landing is so new, I don't see any advantage to them to try to tear that down and build something, especially with the cost of money these days.
Yeah.
Right now, they're far better off to continue to take what they're getting out of that right now and for the foreseeable future.
Well, and how would that even work from the ownership structure there, right? Because you're
Right,
buying units. I'm sure there's some limitations on what buying means in that situation,
Right.
which I don't know about.
well, Edgewood is all rental.
Right, but I'm talking about Martin's Landing.
And yeah, so that's why I think that if they think that we're gonna make a change that makes them vulnerable to improvements that they may not want, that's why I think there might be a little pushback from there. And I think we just need to make sure that, if going to town meeting, if a group over there can get 50 or 60 people into town meeting, they can control how the whole thing goes. So we have to make sure that we have a united front if we're gonna make this all work.
Yeah, it seems like potential impact on the schools, if someone were to redevelop Edgewood, the impact would perhaps be minimal, because you'd be going from we already have 400-something units that could have school-age children in them, to some number that is similar to that, or perhaps a little larger, I don't know, that would, presumably have roughly the same number of school-age children. The greater impact would be if somehow they were able to redevelop Martin's Landing, which has virtually no school-age children, but then all of a sudden could have some number impacting the schools.
And that's the thing, we'd have to take some of those restrictions away from them.
Right.
That we have on that property right now.
Right.
And let it be developed multifamily, and that's why I think there might be a little resistance coming from that location.
Yeah. But I would say that, given the fact that really only half of what you're proposing, that adds risk of impact on schools, and that half is much less likely to be redeveloped. From a school standpoint, I think that
How much expansion room do we have in the school system?
so it depends on how you want the answer. And Dr. Daly can nod his head or jump up and stop me. But I think it depends on there's a couple ways to look at it. One is there is the school committees and the town's ideal range of class sizes and how much wiggle room there is in that. And then there's the question of, do you go beyond those ideal ranges? The school buildings themselves, and I'm sure Dr. Daly wants to speak to this, but school buildings themselves, there's some capacity, but
Well, again, I think because of the newness of some of the structures over there, I don't foresee any major changes.
Yep.
In what's coming out of there now, coming into the school department. So
And the corresponding part is just, if you have more students, you need more teachers and more other things that cost
budgetary
money.
impact,
So it's a budgetary issue. So it's not just a spatial issue. Like if there were 100 more kids showed up at a school, we could physically get them in the building, but
theoretically, if
Yeah.
we build more infrastructure, we collect more taxes.
Correct.
That's the concept.
Yeah.
But so developing in
That's a good one.
a housing way as opposed to developing in a commercial
Yeah.
way is not as productive.
Yeah. And I feel like historically school committee members have been hesitant to say they want more students because we have to deal with the budgetary issues of that. I would also say, on the other hand, I have I believe in people having houses, and you have to be able to, everything can't be not in my backyard, you have to be able to house families somewhere and have, ideally have them be affordable so that we can educate children. And so,
it is.
yeah, again, part of me almost wished you were pushing for something a little bit more than what you guys are doing, because I think this is literally seems like the bare minimum what you could do to meet the requirements.
Don't worry, Jeff, they'll be back.
Yeah.
We'll be back, yeah.
That was January 21.
Yeah.
Give it a year or two.
Yeah.
We'll be sitting right back here again.
So,
And then after about 3 times, they'll be saying no mas.
yeah. So, but again, I think just from, meeting the requirements, like this is the most logical and the easiest way to do it, I think.
This gets us over the hump. It gets us into a position to deal with, with any other changes or any more requirements that might come along with. But I still believe that ultimately, and I think if it really gets too crazy, it's time for us to call our elected officials in and have a little discussion with them. But I think that at some point, they have to recognize, they're looking at basically 177 communities that are adjacent out of the 351 in the state. So they're at some point, they're gonna have to take a look at the ones that have no ability whatsoever to comply and create either a waiver program
Right.
or another thing. So, and they're not gonna do that until the last minute. So I know they keep adding conditions on, Dave was talking about those, but at some point, practicality has gotta creep in.
Yep. Dr. Daly?
Yeah, so just sure, Michael, does a wonderful job with these enrollment projections in the book. There's about 10 different graphs. This is one we'll start with just to show kind of where we are and where we're going. We're kind of at a low right now. We came out of a bubble a few years ago. When this building opened, we were at a much higher, especially for a high school and middle school. But you can see we're steadily growing from around 2354 now, projections to 2652 in about 10 years. And that's, Michael's done a great job of matching up. You can see in some of the other slides just sort of how close we are on some of these projections and our actuals. We then break it down by different levels and schools. This one shows just sort of so you get a sense of where the growth is. Seeing a lot at elementary and at high school. So we're at, as Rich said very well, contractually we can have up to 30 students in a classroom. There's a cost to some desks and some equipment. We have small class sizes. That's a reason why a lot of people move to North Reading for the schools. And so to go to those maxing out every classroom, there's obviously costs there, staffing and supports and everything that would be needed. But beyond a certain point, when we talk about adding classrooms, there's really not additional space available. So we'd be talking about new space, new buildings, all that needs. So it's sort of that, it's both sides, double-edged sword, right? So, new revenue to build new spaces and things, or, but at a certain point, it might break. So, but we're certainly projecting increasing in size in the next 10 years.
And you base that on birth rate?
So that
Where's that slide?
the majority of what's behind this data is birth rates, and then assuming what's historically happened in the past in terms of progression ratios of students from one grade to the next will continue to be the same. So we start to look at data of students that kind of, for lack of a better term, sort of survive or progress to the next grade, especially when they transition from grade 8 to grade 9. We look at that historical data and see what students might be going elsewhere or coming in, and we try to develop a ratio that is as accurate as possible, but mainly looking at birth rates and historical data. If we know of certain market trends in the economy or something that's going on in the community that might cause a spike or in migration of school-age children, we try to adjust those ratios accordingly. We base it on just as known information as we can, and we try to come up with it to develop those projections. But historically, we've been able to get it like less than 1% accuracy.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Thank you very much. Any other comments, questions?
Nope. I think,
That was a good presentation.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Oh,
Thanks so
I have
much.
one last question, and it's more curiosity than anything. Being that we're MBTA adjacent, is our requirement different from an actual MBTA community?
Yes. It's the unit capacity, I think, is higher in the MBT, the communities that actually have the stations in them. And they are also, I think the biggest difference and the biggest challenge for those communities that actually have transit in them are that half the land area has to be within half a mile of their transit station. And in some communities, a lot of that is wetland, or a lot of that is floodplain, or a lot of it is aquifer protection district, or a lot of it is just not otherwise suitable for multifamily housing. So some communities are really struggling with that. I'm sorry.
Thinking of Reading populated
I
by
know,
single
Reading
family,
or business
family housing, right?
districts,
I mean,
it's hard. So
Well,
what happens if they can't comply?
Well, Reading is one of the things that we looked at because the development around their railway system there is pretty intense already.
it is, it has been
Yeah,
happening.
They've been adding a lot more units.
Huh?
They've been adding a lot more units
Yeah, so
around there
they're
in the last 5 years.
they're pretty well positioned. But
Do
they're
they-
one of the examples that we use that they've already done enough or so much that they can't comply with it. They can't add any more. There's
Right,
gotta be
I
some-
was wondering if there was a
waiver
trigger there or an exception there, that if you've already been doing it and developed as much as you can.
They don't have any exceptions in it yet, but I think that at some point they're gonna have to.
Yeah, there's not an exception, but for Reading, a lot of the zoning that has resulted in all of that housing is pretty close to complying. Not all of it. Right, so they have to make some adjustments. They built a lot of that housing with 40R districts, so those 40R districts have slightly different requirements, so they're working with the state to adjust those requirements. So I think they will make it work, but it's definitely a bigger challenge because we have the freedom of putting our district wherever we think it's appropriate, and the other communities don't. So anyway.
But on the other side, I saw there was like a low adjacent small population or small town, is that less than 7,000?
Yes, we don't qualify.
Right. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
I will entertain a motion to adjourn this
I
meeting.
move to adjourn the CPC joint meeting.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes 4-0.
So I'll adjourn the CPC meeting. It's as the chairman's prerogative.
Here we go.